Hello, my name is Andrew Watts, and I'm a composer and student intern with the Boston Chamber Music Society. Today we are here with John Harbison to discuss his piano trio number 2, entitled Short Stories. John, very excited to be talking with you today about your composition. We're excited to have you.
Good to be here.
Thanks. I had an opportunity to hear the recording with the Amelia Piano Trio of your first and second piano trios, and also a chance to speak with Riko Aizawa. And immediately I realized that the two compositions varied immensely in style and in tone. And I know you're a very prolific composer. Why did you choose to leave a gap of time between these two works?
Well, it was really a question of opportunity. I like the medium a lot, and I've always enjoyed the particular sonority of the trio. I like it very much. It doesn't mean that each time I would address it, I'd try to make it sound somewhat different than the pieces that I know. But it was over 30 years in between, I guess, well over 30 years. But it really was just a question of really being asked to do it. And the first one was more or less a volunteer piece, though I had 3 performers that I had in mind for the piece. And this one was a request from players that I already knew and who I had met at various other kinds of occasions, mostly summer festivals. I was just glad to get back to the medium. It was a real pleasure, and it was also nice to write again for players that I knew.
Yeah, definitely. I know that you had stated in articles previously that you draw upon the classical trio and the restaurant trio when writing your first piano trio. How do those two chamber music subgenres play into your second trio?
Well, the restaurant trio, probably less. And the early history of the classical trio more. That is to say, the trio up through Haydn, and that's Haydn. That's about it. Okay. And I got very interested in Haydn's trio writing through programming many of those pieces on the festival at Token Creek. And now we've done, I think, upwards of 12 to 15 of those great pieces. Many of them are some of Haydn's last and most free-form, freewheeling chamber pieces. Okay. So I was very struck by how he heard and conceived the medium of the trio as so different than the way it actually developed later on, which in certain ways was as a surrogate for the orchestra. That is, the piano and those 2 strings with making a really very comprehensive, imposing kind of sound, the one that we know from the Brahms trios or from the Ravel. Very great sonority pieces. The Haydn trio is more about line interplay, conversation, a kind of a notion of the combination that is not yet set, so that very often the texture becomes very grainy and spare and almost like a much earlier music, like pre-Handel or Handel. And that appealed to me a lot when I addressed it this time, to think about almost the prehistory of that combination.
Yeah, I heard a lot of instances in the second piano trio where it's just almost soloistic piano writing, and then it's paired with 2 strings, or there's a dialogue between the strings and the piano.
And there's actually rather few places where all 3 players play. Yeah. And that struck me as something that I understood from the Haydn trios, really, from those really very eloquent places where it's less than the full complement that we're hearing. And I also really like the idea that the texture of this piece is really extremely spare and lean, except for a few places where it's extremely to the other side. Yeah. So that one of the ways that I heard it in my mind was as occasionally a burst out of a very dense but linear conversation. And that's something that the trios of the great classic period don't tend to do too much. They tend to speak in a more of a oratorical, vocative kind of address to a sort of out into the large hall. The Haydn trio speak to the players and to a few people who are assembled in a small room.
Right.
And there's a lot of my trio that shall we say, sort of draws the discourse in rather than broadcasting it out.
Yeah, I feel that there's times where the beginning of a movement would start out very subtle with the strings, and then towards the climax it would be very complex rhythmically, and then it would return at the very end to, I think, the last movement, Enigma.
Yes, definitely follows that pattern. And that also follows the pattern very much of less than everyone playing a lot until a very, very few moments. Yeah. And you're right that the places where they played together are often a very, very extreme intensification of the independence of the voices. Third movement is like that. It's a very motoric movement, and when they finally really sort of get towards the climax, the rhythm almost disengages. It's as if the gears strip and the players begin to work on independent cycles. And that's something that I felt that I wanted to keep in reserve in this piece for those moments when some sort of big long-range goal is reached. And in the first movement, I was trying something which is new to my music, but very important to me these days, which is trying to make the things that succeed each other appear to be far-fetched and only add up when we get to the end of the whole sequence, and we think, well, maybe they do belong together. So that at the immediate encounter, we think that's not really what we expect should succeed here, what should happen. That also is something I've begun to be engaged by very much recently, and I think, again, is something of the Haydn effect for me, the sense that many points in Haydn we are completely lost for a moment as to how his train of thought is working. Yeah. And it's almost as if he's only entertaining himself at those moments. Yeah. And eventually you begin, because you trust the composer and because he has something overall in view, you begin to accept what is perhaps often at first a rather strange encounter. I wanted that, particularly in the first movement, to happen, that the listener feels for a while puzzled about a succession of things which don't immediately seem like they belong. And I've very much thought of the third movement as the counterforce to that. That is, it is very continuous. The issue there is much more how do you escape? And what can sort of bring such a sort of a headlong piece to a close? And in that instance, really, I then decided that the thing that could bring it to a close is that they lose touch. They don't maintain what we would call an ensemble coherence.
Okay. And the third movement is entitled Rumors and Reports.
Yeah, I sort of like the titles. I'm not sure I like the idea of looking for a narrative, though that one is a very literal title in that the introduction I think of as a kind of a secret pass back and forth and a kind of an insinuation, and then it is followed by something extremely declarative, which is in the shape of news, but it isn't really a storyline as much as just an encounter with a character, with a kind of musical character. But I do like the titles, and I think they all add up to something. The second movement, Ballad, was the idea of inventing a kind of an ethnic song for a culture that I don't know exists. Okay. so that in some place not to be named and not probably to be found, this might be a kind of a folk melody or something that people would want to play together. And the whole discourse or delivery of it has built into it a kind of declamation, which I also thought I needed to really notate for it to be effective, of a kind of hesitation in the delivery of the melody, a sort of bardish, wandering troubadour kind of effect. And then the last title I also like because I didn't really know how to describe the subject matter, except that I wasn't sure about it really until the very last part of the movement, where I brought back a kind of a fragment, which then made more sense to me at that time. But enigma in the sense that something is mysterious, and if I knew the answer, I wouldn't necessarily write the piece.
Okay. I think that the final phrase of enigma sounds very fatalistic, though. It has this kind of tolling of bells, right, the fate of time with the piano.
Yes, and that's what I mean by there is a kind of a more explicit thing happens at the end, but I wasn't clear on it until I got there.
Okay. With going back to the third movement, Rumors and Reports, the introduction of the violin and then underneath it, very subtle introduction of the cello is very beautiful. And then that kind of momentum at the very end returns, but sounds very displaced. Does that play into the title as well?
It does. I wanted the evaporation, the little coda that you just mentioned, to suggest some of the character of the opening, but even more underground. It's a very high texture, but my sense of the effect of it is that it's extremely blurred. And you're right about the opening. The opening is anything but a clear statement. It's an interrogative. That is the fact. I think a lot of about phrases either answering or stating or asking, and that one's an open question all the way through. And the relationship even between the parts, the accompanying voice is kind of on its own track. And I think what interested me actually about that in the whole form is that the piece is constantly up to that point displacing its energy. It's not really allowing anything to become, to spin forward. And I needed one piece where it's almost like I had a mechanism that I was arresting, and then I let the spring loose for a while and let it fly forward. Okay. And then it stopped by the texture you just mentioned, that sort of evaporating thing. And to my ear, in the last movement, with those rather short little, I'd say rather suppressed kind of statements that keep succeeding each other, that is the result of having opened the spring and not having really too much left.